Hello, my dear. Thank you so much for joining me today. So, gather round the fire that you cannot see as I shall read to you more Irish myths and fairy tales, specifically over the Banshee and the Dullahan. So, without much more further ado, no more pomp and circumstance, I shall go ahead and start reading to you all today. If that is okay with you. Our first story for today is called The Banshee of the McCarthys, attributed to T. Crofton Crocker. Charles McCarthy was, in the year 1749, the only surviving son of a very numerous family. His father died when he was little more than 20, leaving him the McCarthy estate, not much encumbered, considering that it was an Irish one. Charles was gay, handsome, unfettered either by poverty, a father, or guardians, and therefore was not, at the age of 21, a pattern of regularity and virtue. In plain terms, he was an exceedingly dissipated, I fear I may say debauched, young man. His companions were, as may be supposed, of the higher classes of the youth in his neighborhood, and, in general, of those whose fortunes were larger than his own, whose dispositions to pleasure were, therefore, under still less restrictions, and in whose example he found at once an incentive and an apology for his irregularities. Ah, hello, Looney Neptune. Thank you for popping by. Besides, Ireland, a place to this day not very remarkable for the coolness and steadiness of its youth, was then one of the cheapest countries in the world in most of those articles which money supplies for the indulgence of passions. The odious exciseman, with his portentous book in one hand, and his unrelenting pen held in the other, or stuck behind his hat band, and the ink bottle, black emblem of the informer, dangling from his waistcoat button. When not, then, from alehouse to alehouse, denouncing all those patriotic dealers in spirits who preferred selling whiskey, which had nothing to do with English laws, but to elude them, to retailing that poisonous liqueur which derived its name from the British Parliament, that compelled its circulation among a reluctant people. Or if the gauger, recording angel of the law, wrote down the peccadillo of a publication He dropped a tear upon the word and blotted it out forever. For, welcome to the tables of their hospitable neighbors, the guardians of the excise, for they existed at all, scrumpled to abridge those luxuries which they freely shared. And thus the competition in the market between the smuggler, who incurred little hazard, and the personages, gilt flare trader, who enjoyed little protection, made Ireland a land of flowing, not merely with milk and honey, but with whiskey and wine. And the enjoyments supplied by these, and in the many kindred pleasures to which frail youth are all but too prone, Charles McCarthy indulged to such a degree that just about the time when he had completed his 24th year, after a week of great excess, he was seized with a violent fever, which, from its malignity and the weakness of his frame, left scarcely a hope for his recovery. His mother, who had at first made many efforts to check his vices, and at last had been obliged to look on his rapid progress to ruin in silent despair, watched day and night at his pillows. The anguish of parental feeling was blended with the still deeper misery which those only know who have striven hard to rear in virtue and piety a beloved and favorite child, have found him grown up at that their hearts could desire, until he reached manhood, and then, when their pride was the highest, and their hopes almost ended in the fulfillment of their fondest expectations, have seen this idol of their affections plunge headlong into a course of reckless profligacy, and after a rapid career of vice, hang upon the verge of eternity, without the leisure or the power of repentance. Fervently she prayed that, if his life could not be spared, at least the delirium, which continued with increasing violence from the first few hours of his disorder, might vanish before death, and leave enough of the light and of calm for making his peace with offended heaven. After several days, however, nature seemed quite exhausted, and he sunk into a state too like death to be mistaken for the repose of sleep. His face had that pale, glossy, marble look, which is in general so sure a symptom that life has left its tenement of clay. His eyes were closed and sunk, the lids having compressed and stiffened appearance which seemed to indicate that some friendly hand had done its last office. The lips, half closed and perfectly ashy, discovered just so much of the teeth as to give the features of death their most ghastly but most impressive look. He lay upon his back, with his hand stretched beside him, quite motionless, and his distracted mother, after repeated trials, could discover not the least symptom of animation. The medical man who attended, having tried the usual modes for ascertaining the presence of life, declared at last his opinion that it has flown, and prepared to depart from the house of mourning. His horse was seen to come to the door. A crowd of people who were gathered before the doors, or scattered in groups on the lawn in front, gathered around which the door opened. These were tenants, fosterers, and poor relations of the family, with others attracted by affection or by that which interest which partakes the curiosity, but is something more, and which collects the lower ranks around a house where a human being is in his passage to another world. They saw the professional man come out from the hall door and approach his horse, and while slowly, with a melancholy air, he prepared to mount, they clustered round him with inquiring and wistful looks. Not a word was spoken, but their meaning could not be misunderstood, and the physician, when he had got onto his saddle, and while the servant was still holding the bridle, as if to delay him, and looking anxiously at his face, as if expecting that he would relieve the general suspense, shook his head and said in a low voice, "It's all over, James," and moved away slowly. The moment he had spoken, the women present, who were very numerous, uttered a shrill cry, which, having been sustained for about half a minute, fell suddenly into a full, loud, continued and discordant, but plaintive wailing, above which occasionally were heard the deep sounds of a man's voice, sometimes in deep sobs, sometimes in more distinct exclamations of sorrow. This was Charles' foster brother, who moved about the crowd, now clapping his hands, now rubbing them together in the agony of grief. The poor fellow had been Charles' playmate and companions when a boy, and afterwards his servant, had always been distinguished by his peculiar regard, and loved his young master as much, at least as he did, his own life. Ah, hello, Darla. Welcome in. Oh, and happy birthday, if I'm interpreting that correctly. How exciting. When Miss McCarthy became convinced that the blow was indeed struck, and that her beloved son was sent to his last account, even in the blossoms of his sin, she remained for some time gazing with fixedness upon his cold features. Then, as if something had suddenly touched the string of her tenderness affections. Tear after tear trickled down her cheeks, pale with anxiety and watching. Still, she continued looking at her son, apparently unconscious that she was weeping, without once lifting her handkerchief to her eyes, until reminded of the sad duties which the custom of the country imposed upon her by the crowd of females belonging to the better class of the peasantry, who now, crying audibly, nearly filled the apartment. She then withdrew to give directions for the ceremony of walking, and for supplying the numerous visitors of all ranks with refreshments usual on these melancholy occasions. Though her voice was scarcely heard, and though no one saw her but the servants and one or two old followers of the family, who assisted her in the necessary arrangements, everything was conducted with the greatest regularity. And though she made no effort to check her sorrows, they never once suspended her attention, now more than ever required to preserve the order of her household, which, in this season of calamity, but for her, would have been all confusion. The night was pretty far advanced. The boisterous lamentations which had prevailed during part of the day in and about the house had given place to a solemn and mournful stillness. And Miss McCarthy, whose heart, notwithstanding her long fatigue and watching, was yet too sore for sleep, was kneeling in fervent prayer in a chamber adjoining that of her son. Suddenly, her devotions were disturbed by an unusual noise, proceeding from the persons who were watching round the body. First there was a low murmur, then all was silent, as if the movements of those in the chamber were checked by a sudden panic. And then a loud cry of terror burst from all within. The door of the chamber was thrown open, and all who were not overturned in the press rushed wildly into the passage which led to the stairs, and into which Miss McCarthy's room opened. Miss McCarthy made her way through the crowd into her son's chamber, where she found him sitting up in the bed, looking vacantly around like one risen from the grave. The glare thrown upon his sunk features and thin, lathy frame gave an unearthly horror to his whole aspect. Miss McCarthy was a woman of some firmness, but she was a woman and not quite free from the superstitions of her country. She dropped to her knees and, clasping her hands, began to pray aloud. The form before her moved only its lips and barely uttered "Mother," but though the pale lips moved, as if there was a design to finish the sentence, the tongue refused its office. Miss McCarthy sprung forward and, catching the arm of her son, explained, "Speak, in the name of God and his saints, speak. Are you alive?" He turned to her slowly, and then, speaking still, with apparent difficulty, "Yes, my mother, alive. And sit down and collect yourself. I have that to tell which will astonish you more than what you have seen." He leaned back upon his pillow, and while his mother remained kneeling by his bedside, holding one of his hands clasped in hers, and gazing on him with the look of one who distrusts all her senses, he proceeded, "Do not interrupt me until I have done. I wish to speak while the excitement of returning to life is upon me, as I know I shall soon need much repose. Of the commencement of my illness, I have only a confused recollection, but within the last 12 hours I have been before the judgment seat of God. Do not stare incredulously upon me. It is as true as have been my crimes, and as, I trust, shall be the repentance." I saw the awful judge, arrayed in all the terrors which invest him when mercy gives place to justice. The dreadful pomp of offended omnipotence. I saw, I remember. It is fixed here, printed on my brain in characters indelible, but it passeth human language. What I can describe I will. I may speak it briefly. It is enough to say I was weighed in the balance and found wanting. The irrevocable sentence was upon the point of being pronounced. The eye of my almighty judge, which had already glanced upon me, half spoke my doom. When I observed the guardian saint, to whom you so often directed my prayers when I was a child, looking at me with an expression of benevolence and compassion, I stretched forth my hands to him and besought his intercession. I implored that 1 year, 1 month might be given to me on earth to do penance and atonement for my transgressions. He threw himself at the feet of my judge and supplicated for mercy. Oh, never, not if I should pass through 10,000 successive states of being, never for eternity shall I forget the horrors of that moment when my fate hung suspended, when an instant was to decide whether torments unutterable were to be my fortune for endless ages. But justice suspended its decree, and mercy spoke in accents of firmness, but mildness. "Return to that world in which thou hast lived, but to outrage the laws of him who made that world and thee. 3 years are given thee for repentance. When these are ended, thou shalt again stand here, to be saved or lost forever. I heard no more, I saw no more, until I awoke to life, the moment before you entered. Charles' strength continued just long enough to finish these last words, and on uttering them he closed his eyes and lay quite exhausted. His mother, though, as what before said, somewhat disposed to give credit to supernatural visitations, yet hesitated whether or not she should believe that, although awakened from a swoon which might have been the crisis of his disease, was still under the influence of delirium. Repose, however, was at all events necessary, and she took immediate measures that he should enjoy it undisturbed. After some hours' sleep, he awoke refreshed, and thenceforth gradually but steadily recovered. Still, he persisted in his account of the vision, as he had at first related it. His persuasion of its reality had an obvious and decided influence on his habits and conduct. He did not altogether abandon the society of his former associates, for his temper was not soured by his reformation, but he never joined in their excess, and often endeavored to reclaim them. How his pious exhortation succeeded, I have never learnt, but with himself it is recorded that he was religious without ostentation, and temperate without austerity, giving a practical proof that vice may be exchanged for virtue, without the loss of respectability, popularity, or happiness. Time rolled on, and long before the 3 years were ended, the story of his vision was forgotten, or, when spoken of, was usually mentioned as an instance proving the folly of believing in such things. Charles' health, from the temperance and regularity of his habits, became more robust than ever. His friends, indeed, had often occasion to rally him upon the seriousness and abstractness of demeanor, which grew upon him as he approached the completion of his 27th year. But for the most part, his manner exhibited the same animation and cheerfulness for which he had always been remarkable. In company, he evaded every endeavor to draw from him a distinct opinion on the subject of the supposed prediction. But among his own family, it was well known that he still firmly believed it. However, when the day had nearly arrived on which the prophecy was, if at all, to be fulfilled, his whole appearance gave such promise of a long and healthy life that he was persuaded by his friends to ask a large party to be an entertainment at Spring House to celebrate his birthday. But the occasion of this party and the circumstances which attended it will be less learned from a perusal of the following letters, which have been carefully preserved by some relations of the family. First is from Miss McCarthy to a lady, a very near connection and valued friend of hers, who lived in the country county of Cork, at about 50 miles distant from Spring House. To Miss Barry, Castleberry, Spring House, Tuesday morning, October 15th, 1752. My dearest Mary, I am afraid I am going to put your affection for your old friend and kinswoman in severe trial. A 2 days' journey at this season, over bad roads and through a troubled country, it will indeed require friendship such as yours to persuade a sober woman to encounter. But the truth is, I have, or fancy I have, more than usual cause for wishing you near me. You know my son's story. I can't tell you how it is, but as next Sunday approaches, when the prediction of his dream or vision will be proved false or true, I feel a sickening from the heart which I cannot suppress, but which your presence, my dear Mary, will soften, as it has done so many of my sorrows. My nephew, James Ryan, is to be married to Jane Osborne, who you know is my son's ward, and the bridal entertainment will take place here on Sunday next, though Charles pleaded hard to have it postponed for a day or two longer. Would to God, but no more of this till we meet. Do prevail upon yourself to leave your good man for 1 week, if his farming concerns will not admit of his accompanying you, and come to us with the girls as soon before Sunday as you can. Ever my dear Mary's attached cousin and friend, Anne McCarthy. Although this letter reached Castleberry early on Wednesday, the messenger having travelled on foot over bog and moor, by paths impassable to horse or carriage, Miss Barry, who at once determined on going, had so many arrangements to make for the regulation of her domestic affairs, which in Ireland, among the middle orders of the gentry, fall soon into confusion when the mistress of the family is away, that she and her 2 young daughters were unable to leave until late on the morning of Friday. The eldest daughter remained to keep her father company, and superintended the concerns of the household. As the travelers were to journey in an open one-horse vehicle called a jaunting car, still used in Ireland, and as the roads, bad at all times, were rendered still worse by the heavy rains, it was their design to make 2 easy stages, to stop about midway the first night, and to reach Spring House early on Saturday evening. This arrangement was now altered, as they found that from the lateness of their departure they could proceed at utmost no further than 20 miles on the first day, and they therefore proposed sleeping at the house of Mr. Burke, a friend of theirs, who lived at somewhat less than the distance from Castleberry. They reached Mr. Burke in safety after a rather disagreeable ride. What befell them on their journey the next day to Spring House, and after their arrival there, is fully recounted in a letter from the second Miss Barry to her eldest sister. Spring House, Sunday evening, 20th of October, 1752. Dear Ellen, as my mother's letter, which encloses this, will announce to you briefly the sad intelligence, which I shall here relate more fully, I think it better to go regularly through the recital of the extraordinary events of the last 2 days. The Burrocks kept us so late on Friday night that yesterday was pretty far advanced before we can begin our journey, and the day closed when we were nearly 15 miles distant from this place. The roads were excessively deep from the heavy rains of the last week, and we proceeded so slowly that, at last, my mother resolved on passing the night at the house of Mr. Burke's brother, who lived about a quarter-mile off the road, and coming here to breakfast in the morning. The day had been windy and showery, and the sky looked fitful, gloomy, and uncertain. The moon was full, and at times shone clear and bright. At others, it was wholly concealed behind the thick, black, and rugged masses of clouds that rolled rapidly along, and were every moment becoming larger, but collecting together as if gathering strength for a coming storm. The wind which blew in our faces whistled bleakly along the low hedges of the narrow road, in which we proceeded with difficulty, from the number of deep sloughs, and which afforded not the least shelter, nor plantation being within some miles of us. My mother, therefore, asked Leary, who drove the jaunting car, how far we were from Mr. Burke's. "'Tis about 10 spades from this to the cross, and we have then only to turn to the left into the avenue, ma'am." "Very well, Leary. Turn up to Mr. Burke's as soon as you reach the crossroad." My mother had scarcely spoken these words when a shriek that made us thrill as if our hearts were pierced by it burst from the hedge to the right of our way. If it resembled anything earthly, it seemed to be the cry of a female struck by a sudden and mortal blow, and giving out her life in one long deep pang of expiring agony. "Heaven defend us!" exclaimed my mother. "Go you over to the hedge, Leary, and save that woman, if she is not yet dead, while we run back to the hut we have just passed, and alarm the village near it." "Woman," said Leary, beating the horse violently while his voice trembled, "that's no woman. The sooner we get on, ma'am, the better." and he continued his efforts to quicken the horse's pace. We saw nothing. The moon was hid. It was quite dark, and we had been for some time expecting a heavy fall of rain. But just as Leary had spoken, and had succeeded in making the horse trot briskly forward, we heard distinctly a loud clapping of hands, followed by a succession of screams that seemed to denote the last excess of despair and anguish, and to issue from a person running forward inside the hedge to keep pace with our progress. Still, we saw nothing until, when we were within the 10 yards of the place where an avenue branched off to Mr. Burke's on the left, and the road turned to Spring House on the right, the moon suddenly started from behind a cloud, and enabled us to see, as plainly as now I see this paper, the figure of a tall, thin woman, with uncovered head and long hair that floated round her shoulders, attired in something that seemed either a loose white cloak or a sheet thrown hastily about her. She stood on the corner hedge, where the road on which we were met that leads to Spring House, with her face towards us, her left hand pointing to this place, and her right arm waving rapidly and violently, as if to draw us in on that direction. The horse had stopped, apparently frightened by the sudden presence of the figure, which stood in the manner I have described, still uttering the same piercing cries, for about half a minute. Then it leapt onto the road, disappeared from our view for one instant, and the next was seen standing upon a high wall a little way up the avenue on which we proposed going, still pointing towards the road to Spring House, but in an attitude of defiance and command, as if prepared to oppose our passage up that avenue. The figure was now quite silent, and its garments, which had before flown loosely in the wind, were closely wrapped about it. "Go on, Leary, the Spring House, in God's name," said my mother. "Whatever world it belongs to, we will provoke it no longer." "'Tis a banshee, ma'am," said Leary, "and I would not, for what my life is worth, go anywhere this blessed night but to Spring House. But I'm afraid there's something bad going forward, or she would not send us there." So saying, he drove forward, and as we turned to the road to the right, the moon suddenly withdrew its light, and we saw the apparition no more. But we heard plainly a prolonged clapping of hands, gradually dying away, as if it issued from a person rapidly retreating. We proceeded as quickly as the badness of the roads and the fatigue of the poor animal that drew us would allow, and arrived here at about 11 o'clock last night. The scene which awaited us you have learned from my mother's letter. To explain it fully, I must recount to you some of the transactions which took place here during the last week. You were aware that Jane Osborne was to have been married this day to James Ryan, and that they and their friends have been here for the last week. On Tuesday last, the very day on the morning of which Cousin McCarthy dispatched a letter inviting us here, and the whole of the company were walking about the grounds a little before dinner. It seems that an unfortunate creature who had been seduced by James Ryan was seen prowling in the neighborhood in a moody, melancholy state for some days previous. He had separated from her for several months, and, they say, had provided for her rather handsomely, but she had been seduced by the promise of his marrying her, and the shame of her unhappy condition, uniting with disappointments and jealousy, had disordered her intellects. During the whole forenoon of this Tuesday, she had been walking in the plantations near Spring House, with her cloak folded tight round her, and hood nearly covering her face, and she had avoided conversating with or even meeting any of the family. Charles McCarthy, at the time I mentioned, was walking between James Ryan and another, at a little distance from the rest, on the gravel path, skirting a shrubbery. The whole party was thrown into the utmost consternation by the report of a pistol, fired from a thickly planted part of the shrubbery, which Charles and his companions had just passed. He fell instantly, and it was found that he had been wounded in the leg. One of the party was a medical man. His assistance was immediately given, and on examining, he declared that the injury was very slight, that no bone was broken, it was merely a flesh wound, and it would certainly be well in a few days. We shall know more by Sunday, said Charles, and he was carried to his chamber. His wound was immediately dressed, and so slight was the inconvenience which it gave, that several of his friends spent a portion of the evening in his apartment. On inquiry, it was found that the unlucky shot was fired by the poor girl I just mentioned. It was also manifest that she had aimed not at Charles, but at the destroyer of her innocence and happiness, who was walking beside him. After a fruitless search of her through the grounds, she walked into the house of her own accord, laughing and dancing and singing wildly, at every moment exclaiming that she had at last killed Mr. Ryan. When she heard that it was Charles and not Mr. Ryan who was shot, she fell into a violent fit, out of which, after working convulsively for some time, she sprung to the door and escaped from the crowd that pursued her, and could never be taken until last night, when she was brought here, perfectly frantic, a little before our arrival. Charles' wound was thought of such little consequence that the preparations went forward, as usual, for the wedding entertainment on Sunday. But on Friday night he grew restless and feverish, and on Saturday, yesterday, morning, fell so ill that it was deemed necessary to obtain additional medical advice. Two physicians and a surgeon met in consultation at about 12 o'clock in the day, and the dreadful intelligence was announced that unless a change, hardly hoped for, took place before the night, death must happen within 24 hours after. The wound, it seemed, had been too tightly bandaged and otherwise injudiciously treated. The physicians were right in their anticipations. No favorable symptom appeared, and long before we reached Springhouse, every ray of hope had vanished. The scene we witnessed on our arrival would have wrung the heart of a demon. We heard briefly at the gate that Mr. Charles was upon his deathbed. When we reached the house, the information was confirmed by the servant who opened the door. But just as we entered, we were horrified by the most appalling screams issuing from the staircase. My mother thought she heard the voice of poor Miss McCarthy, and sprung forward. We followed, and on ascending a few steps of the stairs, we found a young woman in a state of frantic passion, struggling furiously with two manservants, whose united strength was hardly sufficient to prevent her rushing upstairs over the body of Miss McCarthy, who was lying in strong hysterics upon the steps. This, I discovered afterwards, was the unhappy girl I before described, who was attempting to gain access to Charles' room to get his forgiveness, as she said, before he went away to accuse her for having killed him. This wild idea was mingled from another, which seemed to dispute with the former possession of her mind. In one sentence she called on Charles to forgive her. In the next, she would denounce James Ryan as the murderer, both of Charles and her. At length, she was torn away, and the last words I heard her scream were, "James Ryan, 'twas you killed him, and not I. 'Twas you killed him, and not I." Miss McCarthy, on recovering, fell into the arms of my mother, whose presence seemed a great relief to her. She wept, the first tears, I was told, that she had shed since the fatal accident. She conducted us to Charles' room, who, she said, had desired to see us the moment of our arrival, as he found his end approaching, and wished to devote the last hours of his existence in uninterrupted prayer and meditation. We found him perfectly calm, resigned, and even cheerful. He spoke of the awful event which had at hand with courage and confidence, and treated it as a doom for which he had been preparing ever since his former remarkable illness, and which he never once doubted was truly foretold to him. He bade us farewell with an air of one who was about to travel a short and easy journey, and we left him with impressions which, notwithstanding all their anguish, will, I trust, never entirely forsake us. Poor Miss McCarthy. But I am just called away. There seems a slight stir in the family, perhaps. The above letter was never finished. The enclosure to which it was more than once alludes told the sequel briefly, and it is all that I have further learned from the family of Mac McCarthy. Before the sun had gone down upon Charles' 27th birthday, his soul had gone to render the last account to its Creator. Now that was quite a beefy story for us today, but quite a fun one, I must admit. I do enjoy stories of redemption, and I like even more when someone meets death, not in fear, but as if meeting with an old friend. I think that might be the best way in which to go and meet one's end. And I do wish for all who are here that they may meet their end with peace and acceptance. Now, as that story was certainly quite long, in fact, it took up the entire time, I will have to call it here for today. Well, thank you all so much for joining me today. I do hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with me, and I do greatly appreciate that. But without much further ado, my darlings, this must be the end to our story time together. So, with this, I must bid you all adieu. You shall see me in the future, and I do hope I shall see you all there. And although I wish for you all peace and acceptance on meeting your end, I do hope that you continue your travels safely and securely, for I do still wish to see every single one of you. Do not meet your end rapidly. But for now, I do hope that my glimmer will bring you back to me. You could be anywhere in the world, but you're here with me, and I thank you for that. And so now, good night and safe travels, my dears. We shall be meeting one another again in the future. Goodbye and farewell. Thank you so much for watching till the end of the video. If you enjoyed what you saw here today, please feel free to like, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and if you wish, leave a comment down below. On each side of me, there should be other videos from my channel that you may or may not wish to look at. But until then, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and thank you so much for joining me.